A routine taxi ride through rainy New York turns into a life-changing moment for a father and his son. Lady Gaga listens as the driver shares his story. His son, a brilliant student, is trapped by his undocumented status. Without hesitation, she dials a number. The President of the United States. What follows is an unstoppable chain of events. A father takes the stage at a rally, the world starts paying attention, and a door that was once locked finally swings open. Diego Alvarez is no longer invisible. And now the country can't ignore him. Stay with us to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. The night was thick with rain, the streets of New York pulsing with their usual electric rhythm. Headlights scattered through the mist, neon signs blurred into ribbons of red, blue, and gold, streaking the wet asphalt. Inside the taxi, Lady Gaga leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, her breath faintly fogging the surface. The weight of the evening pressed into her, the echoes of flashing cameras and distant voices still lingering in her ears. She had long since grown used to the frenzy, the swirling chaos that followed her name. But there were nights like this when all she wanted was silence. The driver said nothing at first, his hands steady on the wheel, guiding the car through the labyrinth of city streets. He was older, with silver threading through his dark hair. His posture relaxed but alert, the kind of presence that had long since learned to blend into the background of the world. The faint scent of leather and something warm, familiar, coffee, maybe, hung in the air. There was a stillness to him, the quiet dignity of a man who had spent his life listening rather than speaking. She glanced at the meter ticking upward, the soft rhythmic beep barely registering against the hum of the city outside. Somewhere in the distance, a siren howled. A rain-slicked street flashed by, where a woman clutched a child's hand, hurrying across the sidewalk under the glow of a flickering street lamp. Gaga watched them disappear into the night, something about the scene striking her in a way she couldn't quite name. The cab swerved slightly, tires slicing through the rainwater pooled along the curb. The driver exhaled, a long, measured breath, the first sound he had made aside from the occasional click of the turn signal. Long night. His voice was low, edged with the gravel of too many hours spent awake. He hadn't turned to look at her, his focus still on the road ahead, but there was something in the question. Something human, something real. She smiled faintly, tilting her head. Always. The conversation might have ended there. It often did in the small, transient worlds of taxi rides. Lives intersected for minutes, sometimes seconds, before splitting apart again, anonymous, ephemeral. But tonight, something shifted. The rain thickened, blurring the city into a hazy watercolor of light and motion. She glanced at the rearview mirror, catching his eyes for the briefest moment. There was a tiredness there, but also something else. Something deeper. "Do you have kids?" she asked. A pause. A hesitation so slight it might have gone unnoticed if she weren't paying attention. Yes. One word, but it carried weight. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers tightening for a fraction of a second before relaxing again. "He's smart," the driver continued, his voice steady but distant, as if speaking into a space beyond the confines of the cab. "Smarter than I ever was. Numbers, equations, they make sense to him in a way the world never quite did for me." There was pride in his tone, but it was laced with something else, something heavier. He should be in college next year. Full scholarship. That's what his teachers said. A red light cast a glow over his face as they stopped at an intersection. The rain drummed against the roof of the car, a slow, insistent rhythm. "But he won't be." Gaga turned her gaze to him fully now, studying the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands stayed motionless on the wheel even as the engine hummed beneath them. "He's undocumented," he said simply. The words landed in the space between them like stones thrown into still water. No embellishment, no expectation, just a statement of fact. She didn't respond right away. The traffic light flickered from red to green. The car moved forward. The city kept breathing around them, indifferent, unchanging. "His name is Diego." For the first time, the driver turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. There was no plea in them, no silent request for intervention, just the quiet, unwavering love of a father who had spent years carrying a burden too heavy for one man alone. Gaga let out a slow breath, her fingers curling in the fabric of her coat. There were stories like this everywhere. Names that never made it into headlines, lives folded into the shadows, brilliant minds left waiting at locked doors. She reached into her pocket, her phone cool against her fingertips. It would be easy to let this be another moment that passed unnoticed, another story swallowed by the noise of the world. Instead, she unlocked the screen and scrolled through her contacts. "What's his full name?" she asked. The driver blinked, caught off guard. "Diego Alvarez." Her thumb hovered over a number, one that had been dialed only a handful of times but never without purpose. She hesitated for only a second before pressing call. The line rang once, twice, then a voice, deep, authoritative, answered. "Mr. President," Gaga said, her voice steady. "I need to talk to you about a boy named Diego." The driver inhaled sharply, his eyes flicking to her in the mirror, but she didn't look away from the phone in her hand. The rain blurred everything outside, but inside the taxi, the moment was crystal clear. She was Lady Gaga, and when she spoke, the world listened. New York pulsed in the rain, the city alive in its relentless, indifferent rhythm. The taxi moved through the wet streets, each passing light flickering across the windshield, refracting in liquid ribbons of neon. The hum of the tires against the slick pavement, the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers, the faint chatter of a distant radio station. Everything felt suspended in time, caught in the fragile space between one moment and the next. The voice on the other end of the line was firm, steady, carrying the weight of authority. The president listened. Lady Gaga spoke. In the quiet of the taxi, her voice was unwavering, each word precise, deliberate. She told him about Diego, about the boy with a mind built for numbers, about the scholarships he had won but could not claim, about the future slipping through his fingers like sand. She spoke of talent ignored, of potential wasted, of a system that measured a person's worth in papers and borders instead of brilliance. The driver sat frozen, his hands gripping the wheel, his breath shallow. He had spent years learning to swallow his words, to exist just enough to survive but never enough to be truly seen. Now, in the span of a few minutes, his son's name was being spoken in the highest corridors of power, carried through the air like something weightless but indestructible. Gaga's voice softened, but her words did not. She was used to fighting for things that mattered, to bending the world in the direction of justice when it refused to move on its own. She had seen too much, heard too many stories of dreamers turned into ghosts, of brilliance left to wither in the shadows. Diego was not just a name. He was not just one boy. He was a symbol of something far greater, an entire generation suspended between hope and exile. The president was quiet for a long moment. Then his voice returned, measured, deliberate. He asked questions. He wanted details. He was not indifferent. She answered, her fingers tightening around the phone. There was no hesitation in her words, no wavering in her conviction. She did not just ask. She insisted. She did not simply hope, she demanded. The conversation ended, but the weight of it lingered in the air. She lowered the phone slowly, exhaling, her pulse steady. The driver did not speak, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, thick with something unnamed. The city passed by in flashes of gold and steel, the rain-drenched streets reflecting the lights of a world too preoccupied with itself to notice the small revolutions happening in the quiet spaces. The driver's hands trembled slightly as he turned onto a quieter road. He had spent years believing that some doors would always remain closed, that no matter how hard he knocked, the world would not answer. But now, something impossible had happened. A name had been spoken, a line had been drawn in the sand, and somewhere, in an office far removed from the rain-slicked streets of New York, the most powerful man in the country was thinking about a boy named Diego. Gaga sat back, watching the city move past, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. Some stories were too important to be forgotten. Some battles had to be fought, no matter how impossible they seemed. She had made the call. Now the world would have to listen. The city stretched out before them, an endless maze of towering steel and glimmering glass, a monument to both possibility and indifference. The rain had begun to slow, though the streets still gleamed, reflecting the pulsing lights of a city that never stopped moving. Inside the taxi, the air was thick with the gravity of what had just happened. The echo of Gaga's voice still lingered, woven into the quiet hum of the engine, into the fabric of the night itself. The driver had not spoken since she ended the call. His hands rested firmly on the wheel, but his knuckles were taut, his breath measured but not steady. He had spent his entire life navigating roads, tracing lines across the city like veins in a body, knowing every turn, every shortcut. But this was different. This was a path he had never expected to walk, one he had never dared believe existed. For years, he had learned to make himself small, to exist in the spaces where people did not look too closely, where names were whispered rather than spoken aloud. He had lived with the knowledge that no matter how hard his son worked, no matter how bright his mind burned, the doors that stood open for others would remain locked for him. That was the way the world was. That was the way it had always been. But now, his son's name had been said out loud. Not just in the small, intimate moments of their kitchen table, where Diego pored over textbooks, his pencil scratching out equations in the soft glow of a flickering light bulb. Not just in the hushed conversations between teachers who saw his brilliance but knew the limits of what they could do for him. His name had been spoken in power, carried across an invisible threshold into a place where decisions were made, where the impossible became possible. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city falling into the background. Gaga sat still, her eyes following the shifting reflections in the window. The weight of what she had done did not press on her. It settled, firm, inevitable. She had spent her life fighting for the things she believed in, for people who the world had tried to forget. This was no different. This was not a moment of charity, not an impulsive act of kindness performed in the glow of streetlights and fading adrenaline. This was justice. She had met too many people like Diego before, faces that flashed by in the crowds, stories half told before they disappeared, swallowed by the machinery of a world that measured worth in papers and numbers. She had always known that talent, brilliance, determination, none of it was enough without access, without a key to the doors that held power. Some people spent their whole lives waiting for those doors to open. She had never been one to wait. The driver exhaled, a breath that felt like it had been held for too long. His fingers loosened their grip on the wheel, but his mind still raced. He had spent years teaching his son that hard work mattered, that intelligence was a light no one could extinguish. But he had also known, in the quiet places of his heart, that hard work was not always enough, that intelligence could flicker and fade if no one ever saw it, if it was left in the dark long enough. Now someone had seen. The weight of that truth pressed against his ribs, unfamiliar and terrifying. Hope had never been a luxury he could afford. It was dangerous. It made men reckless. It made them believe in things they had no power to change. But maybe tonight had changed something. Maybe hope was not so reckless after all. Gaga's phone buzzed in her lap, the screen illuminating the dark fabric of her coat. A message short and direct. She read it once, then again, as if testing the weight of the words in her mind before letting them settle into reality. She turned her head slightly, her gaze falling on the man beside her. His face was lined with exhaustion, with years of careful restraint, but there was something else there now, a question unspoken but undeniable. She did not answer it with words. She simply tilted the phone toward him, letting him read the message for himself. A meeting. The president was listening. And Diego was no longer invisible. The city was a machine that never stopped moving. But tonight, something had shifted. Somewhere beyond the rain-slicked streets and the hum of neon lights, a conversation was taking shape. A door had opened, one that had been locked for as long as Diego had been alive. The weight of that truth settled in the taxi, thick as the night air, pressing into every silent second that passed between the driver and his passenger. Lady Gaga sat with her phone resting lightly in her lap, the glow of the screen fading as the message she had just received burned itself into her thoughts. The president had listened. Not just politely, not just out of obligation. He had listened in the way that mattered. He had asked questions. He had considered. And now there would be a meeting. Her fingers traced the edge of the phone absent-mindedly, her mind already racing ahead, calculating the next steps. She had spent years navigating a world where power moved in quiet conversations and closed rooms, where influence was currency and change was never given freely. It had to be forced, pulled from the hands of those who preferred to keep things as they were. She knew this road. She had walked it before. The driver stole a glance at her in the rearview mirror, his grip still firm on the wheel, though his fingers had stopped flexing, his knuckles no longer white. He had not spoken since she had shown him the message. What could he say? Words felt too small, too fragile for something this vast. He had lived his life within the confines of rules that told him where he could exist, where he could not, what he could dream of, and what he must accept would never be his. Now, in the space of a single night, those boundaries had been redrawn. The streetlights flickered over the windshield, streaking across the glass like ghosts of the city's past. He had once believed in the myth that hard work was enough, that if he kept his head down, if he gave everything to this country that was both his home and his prison, it would one day see him. But the truth had settled in slowly over the years, creeping in through the cracks in every promise, through the rejection letters that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with paperwork. His son had worked harder than anyone, smarter, faster, relentless in his pursuit of something greater. And yet, until now, the world had refused to see him. But now they would. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself against the weight of it. He thought of Diego, of the nights he had spent hunched over textbooks, his pencil moving furiously across pages filled with equations too complex for the untrained eye. He thought of the competitions, the medals, the teachers who had pulled him aside, their voices full of the kind of quiet frustration that only came when someone's potential was undeniable and wasted. He thought of the conversations he had avoided having, the ones where he should have told his son the truth. That brilliance was not always enough. That no matter how many competitions he won, no matter how many doors he knocked on, some of them would never open. Except now, one of them had. Gaga's voice cut through the quiet, low and certain, the kind of voice that carried even when it wasn't raised. She spoke not of what might happen, but of what would. This was not a favor. This was not charity. This was a demand for justice, and she was not in the habit of making requests. She had already started the process. Calls were being made, arrangements set into motion. The details would unfold in the coming days, but Diego's name had been spoken in the halls of power, and once something had been seen, it could not be unseen. The driver listened, his eyes fixed on the road, his mind struggling to wrap itself around the enormity of what was happening. He had spent years carrying the weight of uncertainty, the dull ache of knowing that no matter how much he gave, it would never be enough to change the rules of the world. And yet, here was a woman who had simply refused to accept those rules. The rain had stopped now, the city glistening in the aftermath, washed clean but still electric with the pulse of something restless, something unspoken. The driver took a turn down a quieter street, the noise of the traffic falling away behind them. Hope was not a thing he had allowed himself to hold for long. It was a dangerous thing, delicate and easily shattered, something that could be stolen away as quickly as it was given. But now, as the car moved through the city, the weight in his chest felt different. Not lighter, but no longer suffocating. Diego would not be forgotten. Not now. Not ever. The crowd stretched as far as the eye could see. A sea of faces, shifting under the golden light of a setting sun. Their expressions a mixture of anticipation and something deeper, something unspoken. Some stood with their arms crossed, skepticism etched into the lines of their brows. Others leaned forward slightly, as if pulled toward the stage by a force beyond themselves. There were children hoisted onto shoulders, their small hands gripping tightly onto the fabric of their parents' shirts, wide eyes reflecting the glow of the cameras flashing from the edges of the crowd. At the center of it all, Rafael Alvarez stood with a microphone in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, though not with fear. It was something else, something heavier than nerves, something that had been waiting to be spoken for far too long. He had spent most of his life blending into the background, learning the quiet skill of invisibility. He had worked the long shifts, the back-breaking hours, the nights that bled into mornings, all without complaint. He had done everything that was asked of him, followed the rules written for men like him, the ones who were allowed to build a country but never truly belonged to it. And yet, here he was. The stage beneath his feet was sturdy, solid, unlike the uncertain ground he had walked for decades. The microphone felt foreign in his grasp, but his voice did not shake when he spoke. It carried across the space before him, each word pushing through the heavy silence, cutting through the air like something undeniable. He did not start with his own story. Instead, he spoke of his son, Diego, who had solved equations before he had learned to tie his shoes. Diego, whose teachers had called him a genius before the world told him that genius was not enough. Diego, who had sat at the kitchen table night after night, his fingers curled tightly around a pencil, his eyes burning with something fierce and relentless. Diego, who had dared to dream in a world that had tried to keep him asleep. He told them about the letter, the one that should have been a ticket to a future paved with possibility, the one that should have meant everything. The letter that had arrived in a crisp envelope, bearing the seal of a university, the kind of letter that most students would have framed, would have held on to for years as a reminder of the moment their life began. But for Diego, it had been nothing more than a reminder of the walls built around him. He spoke of the silence that had followed, the quiet devastation of a dream unraveling, the way his son had sat at that kitchen table, the same place where he had once scribbled numbers across pages with wild excitement, and how, for the first time, he had let his pencil rest untouched beside him. The crowd did not shift. They did not murmur or look away. They listened, because this was not just the story of one boy. This was the story of thousands, of students whose names would never be printed in headlines, whose brilliance would go unnoticed, not for lack of trying, but because they had been born into the wrong set of circumstances. Then he spoke of her, the woman who had stepped into his taxi on a rainy night in New York, wrapped in the glow of a world so far removed from his own that he never would have imagined their paths crossing in any meaningful way. The woman who had listened, not out of politeness, not because it made for a good story, but because she had refused to look away. He spoke of the moment she had reached for her phone, of the number she had dialed, of the voice on the other end of the line that had answered, not with dismissal, but with curiosity, with something dangerously close to belief. He spoke of the day the call had come, the day Diego's name had been spoken in a room where names like his were never meant to be heard, the day a door had finally, after years of waiting, been forced open. The weight of it sat heavy in the air. And then he called her an angel, not in the way people used the word carelessly, not in the way strangers threw around admiration for someone they had only seen from a distance. He said it with the certainty of a man who had seen something shift in the fabric of the world, who had felt the impossible bend, even for just a moment. The cameras flashed, catching the glimmer in his eyes, the way his shoulders straightened, the way his voice did not falter. And in the crowd, among the faces that blurred together in the golden light, she stood. She did not take the stage. She did not need to. She was not there for recognition. She had done what needed to be done, and now she was simply watching. Watching as a father stood in front of thousands and spoke his truth. Watching as the world listened. The night stretched before them, full of possibility. And somewhere in the crowd, Diego stood too, his hands in his pockets, his heart pounding, the weight of a new future settling onto his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. The world had a way of moving forward even when it didn't want to. Time did not stop for headlines, for speeches, for moments of clarity that felt too big to be contained within the small frame of a single day. The rally had ended. The last of the voices had faded into the night, and yet something had changed. The city did not look different. The streets still carried their usual weight of traffic. The neon lights still flickered against the wet pavement. But there was something unseen in the air, a shift, a fracture in what had once seemed unmovable. For Raphael, the weight in his chest had not disappeared, but it no longer sat quite so heavily. He had carried it for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it pressing into his ribs. But now there was space, a sliver of air where before there had been only suffocation. He had spoken his truth, not just to the crowd, not just to the cameras, but to the world. He had stood before thousands and told them about his son, about the dreams that had been locked behind doors built to keep people like them out. And the world had listened. Diego was leaving soon. The letter had come, not just the first one, but a second, the kind that mattered. The kind with a signature at the bottom, with an official seal, with words that held the weight of something real. He had been accepted. Not just accepted, welcomed. The barriers that once seemed insurmountable had cracked. And through those cracks, light had finally begun to filter in. The night before his departure, Raphael watched his son pack. The room was small, the kind of space that had never held more than what was absolutely necessary. But tonight it felt too vast. The suitcase lay open on the bed, half filled with neatly folded clothes, with books carefully placed between layers of fabric, with small pieces of a life that Diego would soon leave behind. His fingers hesitated over the last few items, as if trying to decide what mattered enough to take with him, what pieces of his past deserved a place in the future he was about to step into. Raphael stood in the doorway, his hands loose at his sides. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and yet now that it was here, he did not know what to say. There were no instructions for this, no guide for how to let go of the thing you had fought for the hardest. He wanted to tell his son how proud he was, how fiercely he believed in him, how he knew, had always known, that he was meant for something greater. But the words felt too small. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a watch. It was old, the leather strap worn, the face scratched in places where time had left its mark. It had been his father's, and before that, his grandfather's. A small thing, unremarkable to anyone who did not know its history. But to him, it had been a reminder that time moved forward, that no matter how impossible things seemed, life did not stop. Diego looked up when he saw it, his eyes widening slightly. Raphael did not explain. He did not need to. He simply held it out, watched as his son reached for it, felt the weight of it shift from his hands to Diego's. A simple exchange, but one that held a lifetime within it. The airport was quiet in the early morning hours. The kind of quiet that was never truly silent, filled with the hushed voices of travelers, the rhythmic announcements over the intercom, the distant hum of engines preparing for flight. Diego stood at the gate, his boarding pass clenched between his fingers, the strap of his backpack digging into his shoulder. He turned to his father, the words catching in his throat before he could speak them. Raphael smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with something that was not sadness, but something close to it. Then Diego was gone. The doors closed. The plane ascended. The world moved forward. And Raphael stood there, watching the sky, knowing that something had changed, not just for his son, not just for himself, but for every child who had ever been told that their dreams did not belong to them. Because tonight, one had finally taken flight.